Welcome to Ira's Everything Bagel, where I talk with intriguing people about everything, their passions, pursuits, and points of view. My guest today, Joachim Reimann, Ph.D., was born in Berlin, Germany, and he migrated to the United States at age 10. He combines his personal, family, academic, and clinical experiences to provide a firsthand account of the challenges migrants face and the strengths that allow them to overcome obstacles, all in his new book, Immigrant Concepts, Life Paths to Integration. It's written with his wife, Dolores Rodríguez-Reimann, Ph.D., and available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual places. And for everything, I'm going to call you Joe. For everything about Joe, go to immigrantscreening.com. And Joe, welcome to the show. And by the way, for our audience who may say, why are you calling him Joe instead of trying to pronounce his first name too many times? It's because you gave me permission to call you Joe.
It's been kind of my tip of the hat to acculturation.
Excellent.
When I came to the States, I had a choice according to the people I was talking to. I could be Joe or I could be Achim. And Achim in Germany is a guy, comic book character like Tarzan that swings through the trees and has a monkey on his shoulder. So I was not going to be a Tarzan German style, so I went with Joe.
That would not only be a monkey on your shoulder, it would be a monkey on your back for your entire career. Well, before we get into the meat and potatoes of your book, in the publicity material about the book, I want to quote something from it. Here's what it says. Immigration, and it may be you speaking directly, but it was from the material. Immigration presents challenges for both migrants and their new countries. Yet the continuous immigration movement has led to the evolving core of society, helping create rich cultural environments, unquote. So before we get into the main focus of the book, what is the impact on society, America particularly, if immigrants do not absorb the values of the majority culture? Certainly there's vibrant cultural minorities in the United States, but does it reach an unusual situation where if you have a certain number of immigrants or migrants coming in that don't want to accept the larger concepts of and culture of the majority? I'll leave it up to you.
So there are a number of aspects of this. When we talk about acculturation, we're not just talking about assimilation. We're talking about various ways to do that. And that includes becoming bicultural, that becomes staying more traditional, which is, I think, what you're talking about. And you know, I'm not in a position to judge which one is better, but I will say this. When somebody stays more traditional, let's say doesn't learn the language, stays in their neighborhood, which may be largely made up of folks like them from their community, then there is a risk that people will become isolated. That may have economic impact on them that's not good. And so, you know, I encourage people to explore the wider world if they're coming into a new country. And part of that is also, there was some concern among people that, well, if I become, quote, more American, unquote, then I will lose who I am. And we know that acculturation, meaning, okay, here's the language, here's the roadside, here's what you don't drive on the left, you drive on the right side of the road and stuff like that, is not automatically the same as ethnic identity. So for example, you can, acculturation doesn't mean that you lose who you are as a person, as who your culture you identify with, and so on. In fact, from a psychological perspective, there's something called the immigrant paradox, which basically says that some immigrants actually, in terms of health and other aspects of their life, mental health and so on, do better than the local population, even though they're economically challenged, at least at the beginning. So then the question is, why is that? Mm-hmm. And what we know is that the cultural context, let's say from collective cultures like Mexican Americans and so on, it is actually a support system which is helpful to somebody's physical health, mental health, and so on.
Yes, including strong families, for example. So you could be economically disadvantaged, that typical phrase, but at the same time, if you have a strong family, that supports each other, then you can certainly prosper in a lot of other areas other than economically. And so I think that would be a good example of what you're talking about.
Right. And as generations progress, there obviously will be more acculturation towards the mainstream society. And so across the board, we know that the kids of immigrants tend to, on average, do better than their parents, and actually sometimes better again than the general population of the country.
Right. I know that this is not your bailiwick, but I think part of the concern by some is not immigration or migration per se. It's the process, and whether it's an orderly process, and whether there's checks and balances, and whether security is involved as well, especially after 9/11. I know that's not, as I say, it's not your bailiwick, but I'm sure from your work you could understand that side of the equation, that okay, are we vetting people coming into the country regardless of where they come in, southern border, northern border, regardless of the countries they come from, and then using either the southern or northern border? That is a part of the overall equation of how you help immigrants assimilate or at least function in today's society.
So again, we know from a general overview that I think you said at the very beginning that immigration in the reasonable quantities, let's put it this way, supports the host country, enriches the host country, and so on. But even too much cotton candy can be a bad thing, right?
You're right.
So, and I mean, I have family still right now from my wife's side that live in Eagle Pass. I live in El Paso. So I have direct contact with people on the ground who live in all the places that you hear about on the news every day about the massive migration coming over. So yes, there is too much of a good thing. And yes, we need a more organized process in order to be able to get those people in who under the law have a legitimate right to be here. You know, in the political arena, unfortunately, it's oftentimes between open borders, quote unquote, and walls. And, you know, the reality is somewhere in between. I think the only place in the actual world that has real open borders is the EU, where you can travel from, let's say, Germany to France without too much of a hassle. But I don't think anybody who is reasonable about the immigration process has the idea that open borders is what we ought to do. We should have an organized process. Right now, it's a big challenge because of the number of people from, particularly from Venezuela and the Northern Triangle in Central, you know, America that are coming in. That's a tough thing to handle.
You know, I referenced in the beginning, I always start the show with people who are intriguing and have, among other things, passion about what they do. How did you develop your passion for immigration in a general sense? And then we can get specifically into why you wrote this book and other books on the subject, which are available on your website, which I mentioned earlier, which is immigrantscreening.com.
Well, I think that if you write a doctoral dissertation, you end up, if you're successful, you end up focusing on something that you have a real interest in. And oftentimes that comes from personal background. And so I started looking, and I had years of experience in El Paso working for a private industry council, which was basically a workforce development scenario. And so I wanted to find out if some of the stereotypes, particularly around Mexican Americans and their value in the workplace, was a real thing, or was it something that was misunderstood? And it turned out to be misunderstood. So the bottom line is we pick topics that we have a personal investment in. And my personal investment is, you know, having gone through the process myself, being dropped into the American school system at age 5 with no English speaking whatever, My wife actually spoke English very well when she came to the US from Mexico. So she had an advantage in that part and zoomed through American high school, graduating in the 11th grade. But it was a little bit of a tougher road for me, at least at the beginning. So that kind of lived experience that informs not just the kind of academic stuff that you do, which is at a abstract level, let's do the statistics and see what the p-values are, which regular folks don't know anything about. The whole thing was driven by I think personal experience, both from my wife's part and mine. And also, what keeps us focused on the ground and what's really happening with people is, for example, I did a project with San Diego State University, Islamic Center of San Diego, which resulted in, after 9/11, which resulted in a report about needs in the North African and East African and the greater Middle Eastern population. Word got around somehow. I became the board chair for Somali Family Service of San Diego for about 4 years. And my clinical practice, which is not necessarily advertised on the book and that website, but that is still a part of what I do now, suddenly my practice turned into roughly 60% Somali refugees. So this is supposedly a population that is never going to come to psychotherapy because of cultural taboos and so on, but here they were. The fact that the imam said I was okay probably helped with that. But for my own education, that continued to allow me to understand what the on-the-ground reality, let's say, with that particular population was like, both in terms of where they came from and what they're dealing with here when they come to the States.
Did you discover when you were writing the book with your wife that you discovered things you didn't really know? Because usually when you're somewhat versed on a subject, you can write about it. You may do obviously additional research, but you generally know your material. But here's a case where you may have come up against something you didn't know, such as a statistic or just a insight that, wow, hey, here's something we can write about in addition to everything else we're writing about. Did you have that moment?
There were a couple of different times when, well, let me back it up. The way we did the books was basically to write in a way that lay people can understand. But in terms of the background research and the number of references from peer-reviewed publications, it's academically referenced as a research journal article would be. And the reason for that was there's a lot of misinformation about immigration and immigrants that floats around in the world. And so we wanted to focus on, just the facts, ma'am. Joe Friday from a different generation style.
Dragnet, yes.
Dragnet, right. And so we knew that if the book was going to be scrutinized, they were going to say, oh, well, where did you get this? Must be off the internet someplace from some political site that has an agenda. And no, we wanted to focus on the reality of what's going on and what we actually know. So in the process, did I discover new information? Yes, absolutely. And in a lot of cases, it was like the economic impact, using that as an example. And we try to focus not just on the United States, but on immigration impact in the UK and in the EU and so on. We have contacts still in Germany and other places that kind of inform us around that. And so there were global things that were happening where there was a trend across countries that showed the same thing about, let's say, the benefits of, as well as the challenges of immigration. And certainly as a former German, I tell people everybody considers me German except people in Germany. I'm an American. But I had a certain amount of pride that Angela Merkel, even though she caught some political flack for that, was decided to kind of do the right thing and bring that many people into the country. And so the way that's been handled, even though there is political blowback, is I think we can learn from that. So I learned a lot of the ins and outs of what was going on across the world, things I already had a sense about, but I didn't have like the really the evidence to back up my opinion. And I found a lot of evidence to that effect.
Were you surprised by any of that evidence, or it just confirmed your quote unquote bias? So what I mean is your opinion, clearly. I'm being a little bit.
I don't think I was surprised at how prevalent some of the stats were in terms of across the world. And you always have to be careful because there's something called confirmation bias, which basically means that you pay attention to things that you believe and you ignore things that you don't believe.
Human nature, yes.
Yeah. So I try to keep that in mind, but overall, the writing of the books was interesting to me because I did learn a lot of the nooks and crannies of how this all works. Even though I didn't change my mind necessarily about immigration's, impact in the world, there was a lot of nuance to it that was new to me.
Well, a fellow former German, Henry Kissinger, was quoted recently as reconsidering what his original opinion was in terms of migration, especially in Europe, and that I think there's the challenges there in terms of unsettling or unstabilizing or destabilizing an area, whether it's a country or the European Union per se. So he's coming at it now from a different opinion than what he started out. So this is a subject that's definitely ripe for debate. And in the book, and you mentioned books because it's more than one book. If you want to share with our audience the other books that you've written, that would be fine in terms of that subject. I know it's part of a series.
Right. So the first book that you're mentioning was, let's say, kind of an overview book of the factors that are involved in helping folks integrate. And it wasn't focused on who gets in and who stays out legally. It was more like people are going to get in, and of those people who are going to get in, what do we do to try to help? And that it has benefits not just for them, but for us, and everybody wins. The second book was focused more on immigrant psychology. In other words, what do people come in with because of their personal history that may have resulted in trauma, but also, like we already started to talk about with the so-called immigrant paradox, what kind of resilience do they have that really strengthens, who they are and may strengthen our society overall. The third book that is almost out, we're on the last piece of that, is focuses more on general health, public health, global public health, and how immigration plays a part in that. And I think we have learned a lot, unfortunately, in some ways, obviously during the COVID pandemic, which was the time we wrote most of these books. And we kind of hit out, and this is what we did in terms of our professional stuff, and in addition to doing telehealth with folks. And one of the things we learned as part of the pandemic is that when a critical need arises, we need to loosen our regulations a little bit, particularly about people who have been licensed in foreign lands as healthcare providers, physicians, and so on. And that was actually done during COVID. But, and nothing bad happened. In fact, those people who came in and contributed to that, not just here, but across the world, in Great Britain and so on, they probably saved a lot of lives, and we need to learn from that.
I think that's always a case where they loosen the restrictions in the case of a major emergency, because generally speaking, those restrictions are more from an economic point of view, meaning that you have a group of special interests, regardless of what the practitioners are, that want to restrict entry into their field as much as possible. But that's for another day. But again, this particular book, Immigrant Concepts, Life Paths to Integration, part of what you provide in it is practical advice or suggestions for social service agencies, healthcare providers, employers, and you mentioned earlier the immigrants themselves. How did you come up with these suggestions?
When we did a community needs assessment with the local Middle Eastern, East African populations, we kind of came up with a model. And that model was, okay, what are the needs and how do you then address them? And so the first step in that was to do a needs assessment and say, okay, there's a lot of information floating around of maybe what's going on, what's not, but we need to somehow formalize a little bit. The second step is then, how do you inform employers, healthcare providers, and so on, how to best serve that population? And how do you get the word out to the population in terms of where they can get access to certain services? Now, part of what we're also doing is, this is not the book per se, but we talk about a measure that we're doing in the book, which actually comes out of more of the psychological practice background, where we say, okay, through a kind of a questionnaire, if you're an individual immigrant, what are your particular needs? Okay, in terms of the acculturation process, in terms of economics, workforce development, and all the dimensions that are important. And then on the other end, this could potentially result in kind of a service plan for you as an individual, which is maybe different from the guy from the same country that's 2 steps away from you in the line, but this is more focused on you. On a global or on an aggregate data perspective, it could inform agencies about how they need to spend their money. In other words, we're going to put this need is higher than this one, so we're going to spend our money more on this and have this be a smaller pile. And so, number one, what's going on? Number two, outreach to the community in terms of informing them about services, and outreach to service provider in terms of what's going on with the community, so everybody kind of gets on the same page and has an idea of what's really needed. In San Diego, and I think it got a little bit hampered by COVID too, but there's this thing called Welcoming San Diego, which includes local government agencies and all kinds of people that are trying to coordinate this all together. And the parent organization of Gomo Books that I'm involved with is actually a partner organization in that effort.
Do you think that at some point you may deconstruct your book and use elements of it as in a manual form so that you can get specific parts of it to the specific people? So an example would be a manual for an agency, a manual for the immigrant or immigrants themselves, a manual for other kinds of people that would need that information. Do you see that happening? In other words, taking the elements of your book that are practical and putting them in a manual form down the road for those specific areas, agencies, immigrants, et cetera.
So one of the challenges of, I think that's actually a good idea, and I can see that happening. One of the challenges for us is to write a book which is really addressed at more than one audience. And so we're trying to address both the immigrants and the people working with the immigrants. And I understand there would be an advantage somewhere down the line to use this in a kind of a manual format, as you say, in order to say, okay, folks, here is, from the immigrant standpoint, here's where you go, here's what you do, here are the resources, here are the avenues that you have open to you. And also from the other end, to say, okay, here's kind of the circumstances that you need to think about when providing help, whether it's mental health or whatever, to that population. From the mental health perspective, I can give you a very brief example. Some time ago, we learned that here locally, We used to have the second largest Somali population in the States. I think it's gone down to third or fourth, but we still have a significant population. And we learned through community contacts that 5 people who were all young male adults had completed suicide within a 2-year period, which, you know, one's too many, but this is starting to be a trend. This didn't come up through research. This came up through, you know, having your ears on the ground. So then, okay, what do we need to do about that? And I actually worked with one of the family members of somebody who had done that. And so we did a group of community meetings with the local population that said, okay, maybe mental health services are scary, but they're not really as scary as you think. It's going to be confidential. You don't have to worry about your neighbors knowing. We're not going to call you crazy or any of that kind of stuff. We're going to work with you on what you need to do in order to be okay. And on the healthcare provider side, we said, okay, not many people know about this population in the healthcare service field. And so let me give you, you know, a training on, you know, here are the circumstances that tend to come up. Here's the background. I understand everybody is an individual, so the stories are going to vary, but there are common trends in this particular population, so that when people actually come to you, that you're equipped to handle this in the best possible way.
No, that makes a lot of sense. What's your biggest takeaway from the book, or what would you want people to take away from the book of the most important element? There's so many elements to it, but is there one thing in particular that you want people to know?
So I think one of the main points that stuck with me, I already knew, but it was really reinforced by the information I got through writing the book, is that the level of benefit that society can get from immigration. And this is not just people picking up stuff in the fields. This is at all levels of economic growth and social enrichment and cultural enrichment and so on and so forth. We, in today's polarized political society, we tend to kind of not hit the middle ground on that. People are worried, for reasons I understand, about the masses at the borders. But if we are able to do that manage that in a reasonable sort of way, then I think it's not just we're being nice to the people coming in, it's that we're actually getting something back for the effort that we put in. We're going to have a benefit. It's the zero-sum game is whatever I get, you lose, and whatever you get, I lose. And this is a way to try to expand the pie rather than just assuming that it's going to be one wins and the other one doesn't.
Well, that's a great way to leave it. My guest has been Joachim Reimann, Ph.D. He's author of, along with Dolores Rodríguez-Reimann, Ph.D., Immigrant Concepts, Life Paths to Integration. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all the usual places. For everything about Joe, because that's what we're calling him, otherwise I'll keep tripping on his name, go to immigrantscreening.com. That's immigrantscreening.com. And Joe, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Ira.
Appreciate it.
So you have an easy name to pronounce.
True. And join us every Thursday for a new schmear on Ira's Everything Bagel.